Good evening from New York, and welcome to another edition of CWS As It Is. Thank you for joining us once again. This afternoon is the third part of a five-part series on the suicide epidemic in Guyana. Suicide is a heartbreaking epidemic. I can only hope that by the end of this five-part series, more of you would have tuned in and get a better or good grasp of this wanton loss and waste of life in Guyana. The painful and sad reality is that Guyana's population is so small, it cannot afford to lose any of its citizens. As a matter of fact, no country can, but for a country with a population under 900,000, this is devastating. I don't even want to imagine the future economic, psychological, and sociological consequences and its effects on the leaders of tomorrow. For the third part of our five-part series, we have invited two people. Our first guest is Sharmin who's here to speak on the possibility of a pandemic. If there isn't an aggressive campaign to raise awareness and introduce prevention measures. I'm just going to bring Sharmin on. Sharmin, good afternoon and welcome to CWS As It Is.
Good afternoon, Selwyn, and good afternoon to your listeners, and thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome, Sharmin. Sharmin, please tell us a bit about yourself and your relationship to suicide epidemic.
Um, of course, my name is Sharmin Prince. I am actually a PhD candidate, and I am a survivor of suicide. I was in a relationship that I wanted to get out of and had no coping mechanisms or strategies to exit. And I thought that making that permanent decision of attempting suicide by drinking pills was my way out of that situation. So that's my connection to suicide. And I have this burning desire to help to the point where I wanted to conduct my dissertation on the suicide epidemic in Guyana.
Mm-hmm.
But because of it's a vulnerable population and you have to go through all of the bureaucracies to obtain approval, I changed. But despite that, I am still going to do something on suicide to help with raise awareness and even contribute to the prevention of suicide.
Charmin, Guyana is no strange, or suicide is not a strange thing in Guyana. And many of us who have grown up in Guyana have heard about it in some form or the other. I understand that you were at a point where you even contemplated it. But what was your first introduction to suicide?
My first introduction, my mother worked at Georgetown Hospital, and I frequent the hospital, and um, they, I would say they were desensitized, because even as a child, I knew about suicide, but it was always with the injections of Malashan, and they had like a running commentary among themselves at the hospital that it was their medicine or their this potent drink that they used. So that was my introduction to suicide. And I did not understand it. I heard it. I would go visit my mom, and you will hear two or three people just came in, and they will be pumping the Malashan out of them. But the real understanding, and I don't think that my mother and her colleagues also were aware and understand the impact of suicide.
I say,
And I also think that's even common today.
well, many talk about the shame that surrounds suicide and people reluctance to talk about it. I want to go straight to the statistics that are coming out today. There seem to be an increase in numbers. Is this that there are more suicides or more cases of or occurrences of people reporting suicides? What do you think?
think there are more suicides. I was just reading earlier today, I was reading a study done by a University of Guyana student, and if my memory serves me correct, she's also a professor, and the statistics are alarming. And also, there is this, uh, I guess, school of thought going around that there's underreporting. So the statistics that we're reading might not be accurate
Or
because of stigma, because of taboo. Um, I think there is an increase, and there could be a number of factors contributing the increase, but
uh,
the statistics are extremely alarming.
so if this is so dangerous, and I mean, it is dangerous to not have a good understanding or a good grasp of what the numbers are saying. Um, how can we how can we bring the population, bring the nation to a point where there is an urgency of now in terms of dealing with this epidemic?
First, I think education. Um, it has to begin with education. Uh, I am unaware of a program at the university that can train the social work students, even the sociology students, to deal with this epidemic. So the first thing there needs to be like a certificate course, because I've seen the introduction of a suicide hotline. Now, who is on the other side of the hotline? Is that person trained enough to deal with someone who is on the verge of committing suicide, or someone who has the suicidal ideation? Does that person on the other side of the suicide hotline have the skills to bring that person out of that ideation stage to deciding that, okay, I'm not going to do this again? So education and destigmatizing suicide. It needs to become a health issue. And I think that would decrease the stigmatization and the taboo. And because of the stigma and the taboo, that is why there's some that believe that the figures that we have and the statistics are not actual.
Wow. I want to before we get into the main topic of your why you're here this afternoon. I want to go back to your experience. Are you comfortable talking about your personal experience?
Of course.
Awesome. Um, how would you describe getting to that state? Was it gradual or it just snuck up on you?
I think it was gradual. I remember being, I remember getting to the place where when I look at myself, it's not where I had planned to be. Some of the decisions that I've made and the choices that I've made was not a part of my life plan. So I, and I was in a domestic violence situation. And of course, the shame and my commitment, my codependency. I was, I left, I returned. I'm like, okay, I'm finished with this, and I returned. So the thoughts of it, like, okay, maybe my only way out of this is to overdose on some pills.
Hmm.
Um, I can't see a way out. And it began as a thought. And because at that point, I lacked the coping mechanism. I didn't want to turn to anyone for help. So I thought that that was my way out. Or if I do that, I'm going to get the attention I need and somebody's going to help me.
How did you get over that hump? How did you get out of that space?
Um, when I did it, and I remember the first time I think I drank a handful of Valium.
Mm.
And by the time I got to the hospital, Georgetown Hospital, they were like, okay, she has to sleep it off. So they did nothing. And I went back home, I slept it off, and I think the second time I attempted, I didn't go to the hospital because I had a cousin that was not too far away, came and gave me, it was a handful of antibiotics, and he gave me milk to drink so I can, you know, vomit. So I did. But after that, I realized that if I had succeeded, what? And it was a permanent decision for a temporary situation that I was in.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided that, okay, I made the decision to stay in that relationship, and I have to make a decision to get out.
So,
And I mustered every strength that I had, and I got out.
well, let's ask you this here, and I mean, we are very fortunate this afternoon of having a conversation with someone who actually attempted it, and twice. So I'm curious, what was the trigger? Bad choice of word. What actually caused the shift from this desperation, this commitment to the desperation, to, you know what, I value life more. I want to live. What caused that shift?
Failing, the failure of the attempt, and facing the reality that, you know, you could have been successful, and what? Yes, you're out of the situation, you're out of the domestic violence, but you're dead.
Hmm. This is a conversation you had with yourself.
Yes.
So for those times, those moments when there are similar triggers that would have gotten you to this particular state. You said it was gradual. So for those moments when you are experiencing those triggers, when you're feeling, look, I can't deal with this or cope with this, what keeps you away from that dark space? What are the coping mechanisms you use today?
One of the coping, I do a lot of self-talk.
Mm-hmm.
I have had a journey, my life experience, I call it a journey. And on that journey, I have met a lot of people. I've helped a lot of people. And I remind myself that if I had succeeded those attempts, I would not have been able to be on Selwyn's show. I would not have been able to help the number of people that I've helped. I would not have been able to share my story.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives me hope, and also the transformation that I've made from that time. Life, I love life, but mind you, I have triggers, but my triggers don't lead me there.
Okay, so let's go there for a second, if you don't mind. I mean, and I'm only asking this question because I can imagine people who have been in similar situation or may still be in that particular space listening in tonight. You still have these triggers; they don't go away. But where do you lead? Where do they lead you? Did you create that space, that that particular area where they lead you to right now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I'm just going to go back a little, Selwyn. At that time, you didn't have, if they had mental health treatment, or your introduction to mental health treatment is the schizophrenic on the road, on the street, where that the family, the relatives are not coping with them, so they throw them out of the house. So your understanding of mental health was not real. So your experiences of these, where your triggers lead you, you would have never thought to seek some help or some support from a counselor. So I had no idea of that. But when I became a student at the University of Guyana, I got a glimpse into psychology, and I started to dig deep and research, and I started to read a lot of self-help books. At times I had to go and seek counseling. That's after I came to the U.S. For help, for support. Because after those experiences, you have to be able to embrace that, okay, I may have a problem, because a mentally healthy person will not attempt suicide.
So, what do you remember of the people around you reactions to this crisis or this situation you were in?
Devastation, of course, shame, of the stigma. Some people thought I was weak, because that's common. I even see that today whenever there is a suicide in Guyana, and the comments, people say, oh, you're weak, because you may have lacked coping skills, or you may have had triggers that you don't know how to deal with.
How important was it or is it for counselors and people around you, around a suicide victim, or let me rephrase, a person who is attempting suicide or in that space? How important is it for them to use the right language, the right vocabulary?
Back to what I said earlier, that I honestly said, when my plan was, before I came on your show, to call the suicide hotline in Guyana, to get an understanding of who is on the other line. Because when someone has suicidal ideation, you can say a word, you can say something that can trigger them to actually commit the act. So unless you're trained and you have a clear understanding of what you're dealing with, it's not a role for everyone. And at that moment, that person needs a lot of support. Whatever you're feeling, if you feel that they're weak and they're whatever, that is whatever term you want to use, that is not positive, at that time you keep it to yourself. And you avoid that person from being exposed to anyone that is going to say something negative.
So let's go into your the topic here of tonight. You believe that unless there's an aggressive campaign to raise awareness, this suicide epidemic will become a pandemic. Please explain why you believe this is possible in Guyana.
Because they're in the literature on suicide, there is something called suicide contagion, where it leads to clusters. So someone committed suicide in Region 5, and that's the first, let's say the first case. And then 3 months later, you have 6 cases in that same area. So you have they call it suicide contagion, and then it becomes the suicide cluster. Now in Guyana, there are suicide clusters, Region 5, Region 6, and those clusters are occurring where there is exposure to insecticides, or as Paulette Henry call it, agrochemicals. And if there are no regulations on the insecticides or the agrochemicals for the farmers, because that is the main source of the majority of suicide cases, the ingestions of these pesticides. If there's no control, governmental control, it's becoming a problem. And I am not in the place to say it's a pandemic, but as I read the statistics today, we are heading there.
So, describe the more at risk picture, the numbers, these statistics are painting for you among teenagers or elderly and among men or women. Is there.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
Okay. What is the picture that these numbers are painting for you with the more at risk groups? Let's take teenagers versus the elderly, men versus women.
More men.
More men.
More. I don't want to say teenagers. I would say out of the adolescents, young adults, and a lot of Indo-Guyanese.
That's the ethnic group. How?
Yes.
What do you think is the common thread among these groupings? You mentioned the availability of certain poisons, or that's one. But what have you been able to come up with threads or common threads among these groups?
Well, as I read the research, alcohol abuse, poor coping mechanism. I remembered one research that I read by the Dalhousie University. They went in to help during that time when they had the flood. And what they identified, that a lot of the flood victims had mental illness, substance use or alcohol use, and poor coping skills with the situations or the issues that they were faced with. So poor coping skills, and there are a lot of cultural factors, because if you're unable to take care of your family, you feel as though you're a failure, and that leads to a lot of suicide. The changes in the agricultural market and the economy that may have affected farmers, and they're not able to bring in the income like before, so the inability to cope with that.
Just let me arc back a little bit to your personal experience. Why choose suicide as an option? And the reason I'm asking you this is because our first segment, Norca Carter, mentioned, and she put it over very, very nice, very eloquently, that oftentimes people are not thinking necessarily, okay, I want to die because I'm weak, but so much as to get away from the pain, to get rid of the pain. Was that your experience?
Yes. Yes. I don't want to feel the way I'm feeling. I don't want to deal with this situation anymore. And my only, at that time, you're like, okay, with the frustration and everything, and the lack of coping skills, the lack of even support, you're like, okay, I need to get out of this. And you might have seen the only way out is that.
When you go back there from time to time, the memories, our memories always come from time. When you go back to that space in your thoughts, what type of mechanisms do you have that help you to not only navigate that space, but to stay out of the temptation and continue being this person who have transformed from that space?
The goals that I've set for myself, um, and understanding, and I guess I have developed um, this personal, I don't want it to call it affirmation, but my personal self-talk is that you have experienced enough
Mm-hmm.
to help a village. Therefore, you are needed to help that village. So ever so often, I will get into that dark place, but
Yes.
never to that place where I was,
Mm-hmm.
that I would even contemplate the ideation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me just go to the chat room for a second. Robs asked, "How did you feel? How did you feel that the hospital did nothing?"
Well, actually, I was taken there, and they said I have to sleep it off.
Okay, okay. Cher, did the pain ever come back? I think I just asked you that question. Did the pain ever?
Um,
Hmm.
I don't get to that point,
Okay,
Selwyn. No.
okay. And Rennie asked, what are they doing about giving talks at high schools?
Well, last Saturday, the Minister of Education addressed it at the 50th anniversary, Independence anniversary launch here in New York.
Hmm.
He addressed that, and his plan is to put together a team of experts, and he has given them 4 months to develop suicide prevention. And a part of his plan is to introduce counseling into schools. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
So
is that enough time
no,
from your experience?
no.
Why isn't it enough?
It's going to take, unless, before, let me preface my response with this. Unless they're going to use the recommendations of previous studies, it would take 4 months for that group to identify gatekeepers into the communities of survivors of suicide and the relatives of victims, because there has to be a trust factor, and that gatekeeper has to be trusted by the relatives or the survivors, and they would be the bridge between the researchers or the group and the survivors in order to develop a comprehensive and effective preventative plan. You have to go back, you have to interview and understand where the survivors were when they attempted, and speak to the relatives of the victims to know what were the circumstances that surrounded the suicide.
So, looking back, what would you say you have learned about yourself as a survivor of suicide?
I am stronger than I thought. Um, I did not allow the stigma to affect me, and to hinder my dreams, my life plans. Um, and I know that it's important to have a supportive system and coping mechanisms to deal with any situation that you are faced with.
What do you tell someone who is contemplating suicide or has attempted it?
Don't, my favorite statement, don't make a permanent decision for a temporary situation. whatever it is will pass. It's temporary. Suicide is a permanent decision. If you're successful, there is no way for you to correct that. So do not decide, make a permanent decision for a temporary situation. Whatever the situation is, it's temporary and it will pass.
Mm-hmm.
That shall pass and you will overcome it and you'll be able to look back and say, I did that. I crossed that hurdle without attempting, or I attempted to take my life, but I wasn't successful, or I would not, or I did not take my life from that situation.
One last question. For someone who is so keen on empowering others and helping our community, what frightens you the most about this epidemic in Guyana?
The taboo, the stigma, the insensitivity of our Guyanese culture, the quickness to condemn and to ridicule, and the state of the mental health in Guyana. I know that list is long.
It's okay. Thank you, Sharmin.
You're welcome.
All right. Have a good evening.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.